Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, good evening, good evening. I'm your host, Kiana Canada. Welcome to the Kiana Canada Show. We have a lot to talk about today, but before we do, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Remember that your likes and your shares, what it does is it pushes videos like this up in the algorithm. It tells the algorithm that these videos are important. But we must remember that just because videos like this are not pushed up in the algorithm, that does not mean that these kinds of videos are not important. And as an announcement that I often give in these videos, it's an announcement about transnational repression. Transnational repression is where countries reach across their borders to silence the dissent of their citizens. But it's important to know that transnational repression does not necessarily need to be the home country silencing the dissent of its citizens. Other nations can silence the dissent of foreign nationals as well. And so when it is a foreign national that is not in their nation and there is a different intelligence agency cooperating with a home country in efforts to silence dissent, if that is via the hard tactics such as incommunicado detention, extraordinary renditions, or some of the soft tactics like digital surveillance, proxy threats, which we're going to be going into today in this video, then uh, as you can see, that is some of the methods that states are using to actually silence the dissent of people who are speaking out against abuse and human rights violations. Now that I've given you this announcement, the thumbnail that is present is Drapetomania resurfacing? And this is going to structure this discussion that we're going to have today. If you don't know what drapetomania is, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're just going to go ahead and go over a simple definition and explanation that is on Wikipedia about drapetomania. I am going to see if this is sharing. Let's see. Just going to check to see if. So it's not appearing. Let's see. We're going to try it again. Okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. We're in business. Okay, so what is drapetomania? Drapetomania was a proposed mental illness that in 1851, American physician Samuel A. Cartwright hypothesized as the cause of enslaved Africans fleeing captivity. The hypothesis was based on the belief that slavery was such an improvement upon the lives of enslaved Africans that only those suffering from some form of mental illness would wish to escape. Now, Cartwright specifically cited that the tendency of slaves to flee the plantations that held them, since, in his opinion, slaves so basically what Cartwright was proposing, according to this hypothesis, right? I mean, excuse me, according to this hypothesis, what Cartwright was stating was that he believed that enslaved Africans were comfortable and that they were happy on the plantation. And we know that that's not true. And so he, in his opinion, he was like, well, if they're happy on the plantation, why would they leave these conditions? If they left these conditions, in his personal opinion, that enslaved Africans, he said, were suffering from a mental illness. But this diagnostic symptom was later refuted as pseudoscience. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is structuring the video. Let me turn this way. Just a moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, so basically, this is structuring our video about Drapetomania. Is it returning? Is it making a comeback in the global north? And the reason why I believe that Drapetomania is making a comeback in the global north, because in global north states, it is very difficult to launch a complaint against a member of the dominant society. Now, we've seen this in a number of Supreme Court cases back in the day where Black Americans were not permitted to testify against a person in the dominant society. There is a case, it's quite old. It's called, let's see, let me go to it. So the case is called, let me bring it up, ladies and gentlemen. Just a moment. I'm searching for it. Okay, let me look here. It's in my folder. Testimonial evidence. La da da da, la da da da. So the case, ladies and gentlemen, is called, I think this is an interesting name, but I think I might be pronouncing it wrong, but I'm going to give it a shot. I think it's Bayou. It's Blyeu. And it's Blyeu versus the United States. I'm going to try and share my screen, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to bring it up. Let's see. Just a moment. I'll just talk about it because I don't want it to be like very, maybe let's see. Okay, let me just read this. Okay, let me see if I can share this, and I'm just gonna read just like a snippet from it, ladies and gentlemen, so that we kinda just understand where I'm going with this. I think I can share it. Let's see. I'm just gonna make sure that is it okay, we're fine. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, in this case, there was, a homicide where, a Black American in the United States was unalived, and she was unalived, unfortunately, by white men. And so the case went to court, and the federal courts said that uh, To establish jurisdiction under the 1866 Act, the indictment asserted that the defendant's victims were denied or could not enforce the same right to testify in state court as white persons enjoy. This was only one among many criminal and civil cases brought in the Kentucky federal court on such a theory. I'm only reading this little part, ladies and gentlemen, because there is a lot of information that is probably triggering to some people in that case. And right now there is a lot going on, so I don't want to trigger anybody's. So essentially what happened was there was a homicide, and Black Americans were a witness to the incident. And so it was white men who actually unalived a Black woman. And then when the Black people attempted to appear in court as witnesses, the court said that they couldn't testify against a white person, that their testimony was not creditable. And this is what brings us to this video. There is a lot of these antebellum, slavery, colonial practices that are making a reappearance in the global north. And one of those practices, of course, or there's a couple of practices, but one is, of course, not allowing Black Americans to testify against white persons. And this is a practice that is happening in a lot of European countries where Black Americans are not able to, well, they can testify, but their testimony is not seen as creditable. And this is despite the mountain of evidence that they go, say for instance, a Black American is collecting and collating evidence over a period of time in chronological order. None of this evidence is really taken into consideration because, again, it's really not the testimony of the Black person that is being considered. It's actually the testimony of the person in the dominant society. So you can come to a court hearing with a mountain of evidence like this high, or any kind of hearing with a mountain of evidence, and none of that is ever going to be considered. None of your evidence will be considered because you're not white. And I think that we need to sit with this for a moment. Is this the kind of world that we want to live in, where we're going back to colonial practices, where members of society aren't able to express how they feel and are being silenced because they have been discriminated against? And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go back to Horney's framework. And so, his tripartite framework, moving toward somebody, moving away from somebody, and moving against somebody. So to reiterate, we move toward people that we really care about, we really like, we want to get to know, that we find interesting. And we can see this in situations where we want to make friends with people, want to just engage in benign conversations with people, or small talk is what they call it. Or if we want to have like deep discussions, or we are looking for relationships or even friendships, we're moving toward people. We move away from people that we feel are not really aligned with our purpose in life, not suited for the things that we want to do. And sometimes when we move away from people, it's not really necessarily that we're moving away from people because there is like a strong dislike there. No, sometimes we're moving away from people because there's not enough information that we know about those people. And then there is that moving against people. And moving against people is where you're moving against somebody in a way that is aggressive, or you're moving against somebody in a way that is violent. And sometimes when you move against people, it does not necessarily need to be aggressive or violent. It could just be in a way that is disrespectful. And according to Horney, human beings, we engage in all three. In everybody's life, you are either going to move away from somebody, you're going to move towards somebody, or you're going to move against somebody. But Horney says that it is when one person decides to only do one thing, a- and to only, especially the moving against a person, when they decide to only encapsulate themselves in one particular area and to, I guess, act on a particular behavior, exercise a particular behavior, then we say, okay, well, this is deeply concerning. And so I bring that up, ladies and gentlemen, because when we decide that we want to move away from somebody, we're moving away from people who we feel are not going to better our lives. And that's something that Africans did during the transatlantic slave trade when they escaped persecution. Is they decided, hey, these are inhumane conditions. This is not what I deserve. I was brought here against my own will into a nation, and I'm made to work without any pay. And if I decide I don't want to work, then I'm being penalized, I'm being whipped. So if, sorry, the microphone. So if, for example, enslaved Africans decide that they didn't want to work, they were being penalized, and they were being whipped, and they were being beaten. And in some cases, they were lynched. They lost their lives. And so I bring that up, ladies and gentlemen, because what I think is happening in the world today is that Black Americans are being lynched again. And it's not necessarily a lynching that is um, physical. For example, uh, we understand what a lynching is. We don't have to really describe it, but it is a lynching that is one that is that brings infamy upon the Black American. And so going back to the original topic, ladies and gentlemen, and so I wanted to kind of give you some history there on how, one, there was this practice called Drapetomania that really stopped Black Americans from exercising voice, or using their voice to speak out against a persecution. Again, when Black Americans decided that they did not want to be in the slave trade and escaped their persecution, what often happened, ladies and gentlemen, was that they were brought back to the plantation. And there was a member of the dominant society that would uh, state that the person was suffering from a mental illness. So usually what happened was that these enslaved Africans would run, ladies and gentlemen, to the north. And then when they would run to the north, then the slaveholders would come after them and tell this story about them actually having a mental health condition and not being able to perceive their conditions correctly. And that was enough in and of itself to draw the enslaved African back to the plantation. Once enslaved Africans were released from the plantations, once our ancestors gained their freedom and uh, were no longer enslaved, of course, it was during the period of Jim Crow, then there was still those black codes in place that stopped enslaved or free that stopped freedmen from being able, ladies and gentlemen, to testify against their oppressors. And so again, in that case, Bayou versus the United States, in that particular case, there was a black woman who was persecuted and unalived by members of the dominant society. And the only witnesses available were Black people, and Black people were not able to testify because their testimony was not seen as creditable. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us current and up to date as to whether these practices are making a return in the global north. Now, you may say, well, Kiana, where is the evidence that this is making a return? Well, there are a lot of cases about this making a return. For example, with Candace Owens, we noticed that there was a period of time where Candace Owens was speaking out against a particular issue, and then there were a multitude of articles that was written against her, questioning her mental stability, her integrity, questioning her uh, mental acuity. And ladies and gentlemen, I will be the first to say I disagree with a lot of the things that Candace Owens talks about. Probably about 99% of Candace Owens's commentary I disagree with, but there is a 1% that I do agree with. I think that Candace Owens is very intelligent, and she knows how to stand up for herself, and she's somebody that I think a lot of people look up to her. And whether or not you do, that's your own choice and your own opinion. But we've seen this happen against Candace Owens. We've also seen this happen against, there was this, I forget his name. Just a moment, ladies and gentlemen. Just a moment. He is forget his name, ladies and gentlemen. Let's find it. Okay, so the person, ladies and gentlemen, his name was Chandler Jones. And so I'm going to try and share my screen. We're going to be going into this very deeply, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. Let's see. Okay. I think we are good to go. Let's see. Okay, I think we're good. Yeah. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, there was this case where there was a U.S. There was a black whistleblower, and his name is Abraham Bolden, and he actually gave testimony, or sat with Philip Scott, and in the interview, he revealed that he faced termination from the Secret Service when the United States government falsely accused him of accepting a bribe in connection to a counterfeiting case. Subsequently, a jury convicted Bolden, sentencing him to 6 years in prison. In Scott's interview, Bolden asserts U.S. authorities removed him from the general population and marched him over to the psychiatric ward without reason. Now, keep in mind that even though the Secret Service made these allegations against Bolden that they were false, Bolden was actually speaking out against the Secret Service And what happened, ladies and gentlemen, was that they needed to reach for something and they decided to reach for this, right? So they said that he accepted a bribe and they also tried to place him in a psychiatric ward. There, they attempted to coerce him into taking psychotropic medications. Bolden believes the U.S. authorities did this for the following reason, quote, they had to try to put me in a position where from that time forward, that whatever I might say would be discredited. And the only way they could do that would be to do something with my mind, either to drive me insane, declare me insane, because they didn't want to unalive me. That would be too obvious. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is deeply concerning, isn't it? This is something that has not gone away. This is a practice that is coming back. It's coming back. And we're going to actually go to that interview so that we listen to it again. I actually talked about this earlier on the channel, but I think it's important that we review it again, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go ahead and do that. Uh, and I want to go specifically to that point to where he talks about that in the video. So let's see. Uh,
The president told him, said, I'd say, just Bolden, a cabaret, to do everything that he could to alleviate for denying information that they had, that we had, and invested throughout Bolden trial. The judge
I'm
said,
trying to find
you admitting that
the
you
part where
committed
he
perjury
talks
in the
about it. So
Bolden
just a
trial?
moment.
He says, yes, sir. And his attorney,
Okay, it's here, ladies and
the only
gentlemen.
way that they could do that time would have been the United States Supreme
Sorry,
Court.
the volume.
Now,
Let's see.
if it had that would have been sufficient, but they had something else in store for me. They had to try to put me in a position where from that time forth, that whatever that I might say would be discredited. And the only way that they could do that would be to do something with my mind, to even drive me insane, declare me insane, because they didn't want to kill me. They didn't want to kill me. That would have been too obvious, because they know that I had made arrangements for the information to be delivered in case of my death. So the only thing that they could do would be to do what the government usually do, is to declare you insane. So during my time stay in the United States Justice Department system, they sent me to this place in Springfield, Missouri. Springfield, Missouri, the federal prison camp there. They first put me in the camp. So I was spending, it's a 4-tier type of institution there. They have a prison camp, which I was assigned to. Now, the prisoners in the prison camp, they take care of the prison grounds, they serve in the kitchen, and they do the job of taking care and maintenance.
So, ladies and gentlemen, did you hear that? What happened was they manufactured this evidence against Bolden that was not true. And because he had evidence of a crime, he had evidence of a state crime. What they did, ladies and gentlemen, was they decided that they were going to try and declare him insane when he wasn't, ladies and gentlemen. And he knew that they didn't want to unalive him is because he had evidence. He had evidence, and if they did so, then that evidence would have got out to its intended recipient, and that then it would have exposed the government further. And this often happens to whistleblowers and people that are being put through transnational repression. and activists, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a person that is not connected to my family, and there is a person that no one knows about, that is not connected to my family, that's not in Belfast. There's a person that no one knows about, that before I came and filed my asylum claim, that I told about everything. And I have purposely not made contact with that person. That was an agreement that this person and I had, for me not to make contact, because what I wanted, ladies and gentlemen, is that if in case anything did happen to me, then that they would be able to share the story. And so right now, they understand everything that's happening. They know everything that's happening. Although we haven't communicated, I know that they're watching my videos, and I know that they come across it, and I know that they are looking at some of the things that I publish. And so it's important for us, ladies and gentlemen, as whistleblowers, as activists, as journalists, as human rights defenders, it's important for us to keep a person in our back pocket that will tell the story in case anything happens to us, and that can keep an eye on everything that is taking place whenever the persecution happens. It's important that we keep somebody like that. That way, there is a person that is that is documenting all the incidents where you're unable to get assistance, you're unable to get help, where there is persecution that is happening, where the state agents are maligning your character. This is all happening because you know what it does is it all builds up, right? It all builds up into, like, in chronological order, and these persons that we trust and that we rely on, what they do is they collate this information, and they keep track of it. And so in case anything that happens to us, then this information becomes public, because the authority figures, they what they don't want to happen is that they don't ever want their misdeeds to become public. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I would urge you, just as I have done, just as Bolden has done, just as many other whistleblowers and human rights defenders that are speaking out against the state has done, is to, when you know that you are going to be speaking out against a huge human rights violation, that you contact somebody and you tell that person that you are going to be talking about this particular violation, whatever that may be, but ensure that there is never any contact with you and that person, because then that person can be compromised. And then once that person is compromised, then you really don't have a lifeline. And so, no matter how hard it gets, no matter how tough it gets, you ensure that you don't ever contact that person, because, again, if anything happens to you, you need that person to tell the story, and you need that person to release that information out into the public at the very right time. And so sometimes we think, and this is not getting off the subject of drapetomania. This is actually staying on the topic, because this has to do with credibility, ladies and gentlemen. And sometimes we think that now is the right time to talk, or now is the right time to talk, or when there is a switch in administration, it's the right time to talk. But, ladies and gentlemen, the right time to talk is going to be when the right time comes. And you are going to know it in your gut when that is. And sometimes it'll get hard and you're like, "Oh my god, it's time to, like, talk now. It's time to, you know, um release all the information that I have now." But is that the right time? And possibly no. The reason why it's not the right time now for Black Americans to, and this is not only about myself, but this is about Black Americans in general. The reason, ladies and gentlemen, if you're a Black American, you're listening to this, you're watching this, the reason why it's not the right time for you to release any information and for you to tell your story now is because we have two conflicts right now that is dominating the news. We have the Israel Palestine conflict. The Israel Palestine conflict has captured everybody's attention and everybody is attached to that conflict. So your story is likely going to be suppressed and submerged. And so right now is not the correct time to release anything or to talk about anything. Even with the the Russia Ukraine conflict, it's not the right time because there is a lot of people that are attached to that conflict as well. And so it would be senseless to release any information right now or to talk about anything right now because there is two conflicts that are happening that will drown out your voice. And so it's important that no matter how hard it gets, no matter how tough it gets for you to continue to persevere. And that's a word that you should keep in your mental Rolodex is persevere. Be persistent, be patient, and persevere. The three P's, the three golden P's. There was once an attorney, ladies and gentlemen, that told me, he's like, you know what? The reason why I decided to, you know, help you, this was in the United States, and there was a lawyer that helped me one time. He was like, the reason why I actually decided to help you is because you were patient, you were persistent, and you persevered. And so when he told me that, I had always kept that in the back of my mind, and I was like, "Wow, I didn't know, that's exactly, how I was," but I guess I am because, like, sometimes you have to be persistent. And you know what? Who else talks about that is, Les Brown. Les Brown is a Black motivational speaker, and, there was years ago, I used to watch his videos all the time, like, he was very captivating, very interesting. I wonder if any of his videos are online. They're old videos, but let me see. Mm. I wonder if there's, like, just there's a lot of his videos are very long, but let's see what he um I'm gonna share one of his videos, but there's a video by Les Brown. I'm gonna share it. Um, I am curious to know like what he's talking about in this video, so let me share it. Okay, let's see.
Authentic, impactful writers with Grammarly's comprehensive AI writing assistance.
You will fail your way to greatness. Most people allow their fear of failure to outweigh their desire to succeed. When you're willing to fail again and again and again, when you make up your mind to become unstoppable, when you make up your mind to become a no matter what person, then that will then give birth to a part of yourself that you don't know right now.
Imagine, if you will, being on your deathbed and standing around your bed, the ghost of the dreams, the ideas, the abilities, the talents given to you by life, and that you, for whatever reason, you never went after that dream. You never acted on those ideas. You never used those talents. You never used those gifts. And there they are standing around your bed looking at you with large, angry eyes saying, "We came to you, and only you could have given us life. And now we must die with you forever."
And
See,
so,
most people stop short of their dreams and park and get off the highway of life because of the rejections of life. You will always be rejected. It's no big deal. Jack Canfield said rejection is a myth. It's not like when somebody says no and then they slap you. No, it's just, to me, make no your vitamin. Get excited about the no. Why? Because every time someone says no, that brings you another step to a yes. You're getting closer. Trust me, you will win if you don't quit. You will win if you don't quit. Even a broke clock is right twice a day. As you go through the challenges
oh
of
my God, I'm
life
getting goosebumps.
and you look at it and embrace whatever comes to you, don't run from it. Step toward it. Don't try and duck it like most people do.
Oh my God, like he gives me goosebumps, ladies and gentlemen. Like I love listening to him speak. Now, basically, he is just very motivational, and that's exactly what he does for a living. And oh God, I'm getting goosebumps. But did you see, like, he was like, there's going to be no, 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 no. And just because there's no, that doesn't mean that you have to stop, always persevere is essentially what he's saying. Persevere. Like the doors are going to close in your face. People are going to tell you no. People are going to try and make you feel like you don't belong, but you do. And it's about perseverance. And so I really love his speeches. I didn't play the whole thing because I just wanted to give you kind of like a snippet of the speech. But reverting back to the whether or not Drapetomania is making a comeback, ladies and gentlemen, going back to that, there's been a number of people that have experienced this kind of racial mental this psychodiagnostic labeling of Black Americans. So, for example, or there's been many people that have received or experienced this psychodiagnostic labeling of themselves, and one of those persons was Linda Stevens, Chandler Jones, of course, Kanye West, Candace Owens was another person. So this is a persistent practice that takes place, ladies and gentlemen, in the dominant society to try and discredit Black Americans, discredit their stories and their experiences. And ladies and gentlemen, I am going to say something that is probably going to be disappointing for a lot of people, but it needs to be said, and you're going to see where I'm going to go with this. It's important for Black people to really stick together and to understand these tactics that are being used against us by the dominant society. Ladies and gentlemen, there are multiple people that are claiming to be anti-racist, claiming to stand in support of one person in a conflict that's happening abroad, claiming to protect human rights. And when Black people talk to these people, those people are nowhere, or excuse me, when Black people rely on these people to support them, to speak out against a racialized practice, these people are nowhere to be found. Not only that, ladies and gentlemen, but when Black people ask for these people to be witnesses, these people's voices are silent. And it raises the question as to whether we need to really start focusing on ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, and really protecting ourselves. And what I mean by protecting ourselves is being the witnesses for each other. Not only being the witnesses for each other, but supporting each other emotionally and psychologically. And I guess socially inviting each other into each other's spaces. And this is something that I think is very difficult to do in Northern Ireland because there's not a lot of Black Americans here. And if there is Black Americans that are here, then the dominant society has already brainwashed them to not support other Black Americans. Essentially, that is what is happening, ladies and gentlemen. There are members of the dominant society here that are very persuasive and strategic. And so basically, the story that they always tell is this us versus them. And that's really not the way it is. It's not black and white. And they tell these stories like, well, this person is against us. And so we shouldn't communicate with them, or we shouldn't do A, B, C, or D. And that's really divisive. That's really divisive behavior. Is a divisive way of looking at things, ladies and gentlemen. And it's really disappointing that authority figures are doing that. And so oftentimes, just going back to the original topic about drapetomania, um, I think what's important now is that, again, when these practices happen to Black Americans, oftentimes there's no one around to support that person. There's no one around to speak out against that practice. There's no one around to say that that is wrong. And this violates the United Nations Convention on, let's go to that, on Principle 4, and let's make sure we're so there's really no one around to support the Black person who's being persecuted. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I find it deeply concerning that what we can see is that there are always marches, anti-racism marches, united against racism. So there's always these marches that are happening. But when a Black person, a person that is experiencing racism, none of those people are anywhere to be found. And that raises the question, ladies and gentlemen, as to whether those marches are real. Is this astroturfing? What is their definition of racism? Like today, ladies and gentlemen, there was a sign that was up somewhere, and it said something about like being united against racism. And when I read that sign, I was like, okay, I understand what racism is, but maybe they're talking about a different racism, because the racism that I understand, no one seems to know what that is here in Belfast. Like racial discrimination is where a person is discriminating against a person because of the color of their skin, their ethnicity, or their, of course, their nationality, if they come from a place where it's like predominantly Black, in this context. But no one seems to understand what that is when I talk about that here. And I'm not saying everyone, I'm not saying all, but there are a lot of people, when I talk about different forms of racism, whether that is covert forms of racism, whether that is institutional racism, whether that is systemic or systematic racism, there is not a lot of comprehension around this topic. And so, ladies and gentlemen, when I seen that sign, I was like, okay, what kind of racism are they talking about? Because we may be talking about two different kinds of racism, and like, what are they saying? And so I had to ask, like, okay, like, when you say racism, like, what do you mean? Because like, what I understand to be racism is like really the sociological definition of racism in the textbook, or excuse me, the dictionary versus the definition of racism, but that doesn't seem to be the one that's being applied in this jurisdiction. So help me to understand, like, what do you really mean? And that brings me to principle 4, ladies and gentlemen, so that we kind of summate this video, is that we've been talking about how states are using, or whether drapetomania is making a comeback. And again, I didn't really do a lot of preparation for this video. It's really extemporaneous, but um, in this video, you've seen that there were a number of accounts, such as Linda Stevens, Chandler Jones, Kanye West, and Abraham Bolden. These were all Black Americans that were uh, told that they were suffering from a mental illness when they weren't, because they spoke out against an illegal practice. For one, Linda Stevens, she spoke out against. Linda Stevens, she spoke out against a bank that her money was missing from the bank. And she went to the bank and she was like, "Hey, I just deposited $600 and it's not in my bank account." And because she complained about that, they called law enforcement on her. And law enforcement arrested her. And then when they arrested her, they placed her in a psychiatric ward. And I think that they did this to discredit her testimony that there was $600 missing from her account. With Chandler Jones, Chandler Jones spoke out against a practice that violated the rights of the child. And he made a claim that someone in the sport that he played in the football, he plays football. So in football, a higher official in football, what they did was they violated a child's right. And after he spoke out against that, ladies and gentlemen, they put him in a psychiatric institution. Candace Owens, they've never placed her in one, but they have tried so desperately to malign her reputation. With Abraham Bolden, what happened with him, of course, is that he was a whistleblower. He saw some corruption at the federal level, and he spoke out about that corruption. And they brought criminal charges against him that were trumped up and fabricated. And then after they did that, they tried to admit him in a psychiatric institution, which later failed. And then with Kanye West, there is this story. And again, I have denounced the anti-Semitism that Kanye West has displayed. I disagree with it 100%. And I am against anti-Semitism. And I think that the path that Kanye West is on right now is really concerning. But what is also concerning is the fact that we had a psychiatrist, I think it was a psychiatrist or a trainer, who actually threatened Kanye West and said that they were going to put him in a mental institution and that he would never be able to see his family again. And that Kanye West claims that while he was there, that they gave him a cocktail against his will. And this is deeply concerning, ladies and gentlemen. So this raises the question as to whether or not these abusive psychiatric practices are coming back, and whether they're coming back strong, and whether the dominant society is using these practices against not only intelligent, but logical and rational Black Americans or Black human beings in general, to silence their dissent. Again, Chandler Jones was very articulate, and it has a talent, very physical, and I think he was good in his field. Candace Owens is obviously very articulate and very intelligent. With Kanye West, he is a very creative person and has made a number of songs that hit, that I think were like number one. Abraham Bolden was working in the Secret Service, ladies and gentlemen. So, of course, he's an intelligent person. Linda Stevens is a community activist who has a really, I think, respectable occupation. So This is deeply concerning that the dominant society is deciding to do this to Black Americans who speak out against oppression and violent practices. And what they're trying to do is that they're trying to turn it around back on us, ladies and gentlemen, to say that we are the persons that are aggressive and violent, because they know that in this world today that our story does not carry any weight because of our skin color. And I think it's deeply concerning when we as Black people see a Black person being lynched, that we all sit around and watch. That doesn't mean that you have to do anything violent. It just means that you need to support that Black person during that period of time. Again, there is no way that you would see me, ladies and gentlemen, where there is a person who is being lynched or being persecuted, and my not stepping in to help them in a situation where I have the capacity to do so, or where my voice will matter in the incident. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is just something to reflect on, and we need to ask ourselves whether or not karma is going to come back on these people that are in positions of power and not actually using that's not actually using, ladies and gentlemen, their platform to speak out against racialized persecution. Now, this goes to the MI principles. Principle 2 says, a determination of mental illness shall never be made on the basis of political, economic, or social status, or membership of a cultural, racial, or religious group, or any other reason not directly relevant to mental health. And Principle 4.3 says, family or professional conflict or nonconformity with moral, social, cultural, or political values or religious beliefs prevailing in a person's community shall never be a determining factor in diagnosing mental illness. And as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, these are the MI principles, and perhaps states are just really not following them. And I think we should be concerned about that as well. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. What do you think? Do you think that Black people should do more to stand up for each other, especially in jurisdictions where there are limited number of Black people? Should they do more to stand up for each other? Or should people that aren't Black, people that are saying that they are anti-racist and saying that they are allies of people who have experienced racism, should they speak out against the practices when victims of persecution are relying on their assistance? Is the question. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. I'm going to link my Facebook account to the description of this video. If you have some time on your hands, you can go ahead and subscribe to that channel, subscribe to that account, and follow me on Facebook. There hasn't been, I believe my account is being shadow banned because I've been stuck, ladies and gentlemen, at 8 followers, and I've had the account for over a year. And this is despite my account being having the account public. So I believe that this is a way of states to silence my dissent by shadow banning the account. And maybe we'll go into shadow banning in a different video. We're not going to cover that in this video, but this is what I believe is happening. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Have a pleasant evening. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.